Good evening. Welcome to Pennsylvania College of Health Sciences. My name is Dr. Erica Wilkinson, and I'm the Executive Director for Education Innovation and Strategic Partnerships here at the college. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our campus and to share Pennsylvania College's mission of excellence in healthcare practice and leadership, and the continuous acquisition of knowledge. Tonight's vehicle for doing so is our annual Distinguished Lecture. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Louise Aronson as this year's notable speaker. Dr. Aronson is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she cares for frail older adults in the Care at Home program and directs the Northern California Geriatrics Education Center and the University of California, San Francisco's Medical Humanities. Dr. Aronson's research and scholarship focuses on geriatrics education, reflective learning, and public medical communication. She is also a writer and has won the Sonora Review Prize, the New Millennium Short Fiction Award, and 3 Pushcart nominations. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Narrative Magazine, the Bellevue Literature Review, The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the San Francisco Chronicle, among other publications. Her first book, A History of the Present Illness, was a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize and PEN American Bingham Award for debut fiction. Tonight, Dr. Aronson will use images, quotations, and various types of literature to explore one of the most important and fastest growing areas of health science, old age. This discussion will help us to see all and understand aging more accurately, the first step in providing high-quality care to older patients. Dr. Aronson will also explore medicine's fraught relationship with old age, what works well, what doesn't, and what matters most in life's third act. She will also discuss how reading and writing about key patient populations can inform clinical practice and critical relationships. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Louise Aronson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. That was a tall order in the description, so we'll see how much we can get through of that in 45 minutes. So I'm going to do a somewhat unusual talk. When we talk about health and medicine, we often focus on the science. But if you're really thinking about health care, it's both science and art, right? And we get a lot more of the science, at least those of us who do health care, than we do of the art. So I'm going to tilt a little bit towards the art, which has to do with the occasion for which I was invited as well. And I'm going to do that in a couple ways, by using literature, literature with a big L, in other words, good books, and by doing this as sort of a tour through an art gallery. So our first stop, the antechamber to this particular gallery, has a photograph of somebody that some people may recognize. Does anybody recognize who that is? Joseph Stalin, right. So why would I open the talk with a guy who killed millions? Well, it turns out he made an interesting comment. So he said, one man's death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths are a statistic. Now, he used that as a reason to kill lots of people, but I'd like to flip it around and say the one man's death is a tragedy. When we hear the story of one person, one particular person, we respond in ways we do not respond when we hear about a whole family or a whole village or a whole country. And a lot of people know this, but in healthcare we've tended to focus on the evidence and the statistics, and those are absolutely essential to good care. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But the only way you deliver it effectively to a human being is to understand their particular humanness, and that's where stories come in. So we're going to walk down the hallway to the first room. And for those of you who are less involved with medicine and healthcare, there's a little bit of evidence here, but then it will get better. And it's not too bad, actually. So these are some of the top medical journals. It turns out in 2017, there were over 800,000 new articles put into medical journals. If you add healthcare journals, generally, it was a couple million. That's basically 1.5 every second. So it's impossible to keep up with all the knowledge. And it's also impossible because you can't know all that, but it also doesn't, just having that knowledge doesn't mean you can apply it to a particular person, right? An infant's broken leg is different from a 50-year-old's, is different from a 97-year-old's broken leg. So how do we learn about individual people? Well, we can obviously speak to them, but one of the best ways, one of the most efficient ways is through reading what I like to think of as real literature or real books, stories. And people think of stories, well, that's fiction, that's not real, or that's nonfiction, that has nothing to do with healthcare. But it turns out there's some real advantages to how our brains work, how we learn things, and how we remember by using stories. I'm not going to focus on digital stories, and it's not because I can't spend too many hours watching things on YouTube like everyone else. But it turns out that reading offers benefits to your brain that you do not get from watching things. When you watch a video or see a movie, the music tells you what to feel. The pacing and images tell you what someone looks like. When you are simply reading words, your brain has to recruit from all these different areas to fill in what does the person look like. Am I nervous now? Am I not? And recruiting from more areas means you remember things more effectively. So there are all different parts of the brain that are involved in reading. And there have been several studies showing, there are ones with these things called functional MRI images, and they will present the same information as statistics or as a story, and they look at how many parts of the brain light up. And if you present it as a story, more parts light up, and people remember it better at 5 days and 2 weeks. Now, I don't know if you remember it better 2 years later, because the studies aren't that long, but at least in the short term, it's a more effective way of learning, probably because it's pulling from more different centers of your brain. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to say there. The other interesting thing is when people read something, you know how sometimes you're reading something and you think to yourself, I felt like I was there. So you could be reading a mystery or something and the person's running. The parts of your brain that would be triggered if you yourself were running are triggered when you read, but much less so if you're watching a video. So isn't that interesting? You feel like you're there because that part of your brain is activated. So there are lots of benefits to reading. And I think if you're going to be in health and you're going to be taking care of patients, or if you are a patient, or probably just if you're a human being, it's a pretty wonderful thing to do. So it increases concentration and productivity. It increases memory. It improves sleep. It improves rates of depression. It delays, so there are a couple long-term things. So decreased dementia. There was actually this great study of nuns done over many decades. And they looked at the people who read more and had more language skills and those who didn't. And the ones who had the better language skills and did more reading, if they developed dementia at all, developed it at a much older age. Reading also, when you correct for things like income and education, which are obviously confounders for long life, reading correlates with a long life. And then lastly, for people who want to relax or sleep, it turns out to be one of the best mechanisms. So they did a great study where they compared it to soothing music, or a nice cup of warm tea, or watching video games. So it turns out watching video games is the single worst thing to do if you want to go to sleep, but reading, a great thing. So lots of benefits of reading that just sort of make you more well. But I want to specifically talk about what we can find in the literature about old age. And there is a huge literature of old age. There are a lot of different types of books. You will see here that there are some funny books. So old age is always 15 years older than I am. This turns out it might be true. I spoke at a retirement community where the average age was in the mid-80s. This is over the summer. And when I asked them to raise their hands when they thought I was saying, you know, what's old? And so I went from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80 to 100. And we were at 100 and still not everybody was convinced. So that made me think that's true. So there are ones, and then Pimp My Walker, there are ones that sort of are funny. Maybe they're funny. I'm not so sure they're funny. There was a recent one that said How Not to Become an Old Woman. And I saw this on my Instagram, and I somewhat obnoxiously, I admit, went back and I said, there's only one way I know of if you're female, right? That's to die. So unless you want to die prematurely, what we need to do is make old age better and keep working on it the way we work on other parts of life. There are some pretty famous people who've written books on old age, Aronson and B.F. Skinner, but I'm actually not going to talk about this sort of book. I'm going to talk more about, again, real literature, books that aren't necessarily supposedly about old age, but touch on it in really interesting ways. So for some of you who are having like flashbacks to high school English and panicking, I'm going to move from the ancients to the moderns very quickly, so don't panic, okay? All right, so the first one here is Cicero. And De Senectute is really on old age. So this was an entire book about this, which is interesting perhaps because several millennia later, or a couple millennia later, it's still very apt about old age. But interestingly enough, also, Cicero was 62 at the time he wrote this book, and he felt he couldn't really discuss old age. And that's probably right. Old age has generally been considered to begin between 60 and 70 throughout human history. But there's an interesting guy at Stanford, an economist, who has looked at old age in terms of what percentage of people in that age group are dying. And it looks like old age is getting older. It's not just that we're living longer, it's that old age now, if you take old age as being the 2% of people die a year or 4%, it's moving into our 70s. So this may actually be a moving target. But throughout most of life, 62 was still young or middle-aged or senior, but not yet old. So he invented a character who was old, and he then had this character give others advice. And he says at some point, since nature has fitly planned the other acts of life's drama, it is not likely that she has neglected the final act. So I think sometimes we don't think about how being different doesn't necessarily have to be worse unless we make it that way, right? This is part of a cycle of life, and we may have more needs for help early on and later, but we're not the same later as we were early on. It changes over the lifespan. So he also says, enjoy the blessings of strength while you have it, and do not bewail it when it's gone, unless, forsooth, you believe youth must lament the loss of infancy, or early manhood, the passing of youth. So I don't know about you, but I, for one, would not want to be a teenager again, just for example. Lastly, he talks about something where old age is pretty much the last group in our society to really lobby for itself effectively. And apparently this has been true for at least 2,000 years, because he says, old age will only be respected if it fights for itself, maintains its rights, and asserts control over its own to its last breath. So I think this is actually what's happening now as our society is moving to get older, and it's very interesting. So I live right in Silicon Valley, and one of the most interesting areas is to watch how, at this moment in history where the group that's entering the workforce most is people in their 70s, when people are unretiring because they realize they could live another 20 or 30 years and they're bored out of their minds. All sorts of people in Silicon Valley are very excited about saying, like, how do we help you do this? You know, and how do we make it possible if the body is the problem, how do we work around the body so we can still use all the great things that make you a person and let you engage with society in meaningful ways? So I do think it's changing. There's another thing that happens with old age, which is that we tend to tell one story about it. I think part of the problem with the word geriatrics is that we were discussing with some of the students is they say, here's your geriatrics rotation, we're going to send you to a nursing home. And it's great that everyone should have exposure to nursing homes, but all of 3% of older people live in nursing homes. So is that exposing you to everyone? No, that is exposing you to the extreme. It's sort of like saying, I'm going to take you to the neonatal unit, and now you can take care of people through their teens and young adulthood, right? It doesn't make sense. It's one portion of a phase of life that actually lasts for decades. And Plato has a character sort of explain that. Old age isn't one thing, and it doesn't happen at one time like a switch. So the character Cephalus says that his contemporaries harp on the miseries old age brings, and there admittedly are some physical downsides, and they begin in midlife and they continue, and nobody is debating that. But so Cephalus says, but in my opinion, they are putting the blame in the wrong place. For if old age were to blame, my experience would be the same as theirs, and so would that of all other men. But in fact, I have met many whose feelings and experiences are quite different. So old age varies tremendously. We know that people who are homeless, who are oppressed in society, we know people of people who are refugees, people who are people of color, people who are in other oppressed groups age prematurely. It's called accelerated aging from the very stress of being. And that people with more income, if you look at the high income parts of the United States and the lower income parts, there is a generation of difference in their longevity. So that's not biology. That's society and culture. And those are things we can change, which is actually pretty exciting. So next, a few more classics. So Shakespeare actually talked about the stages of life. And when you think about old age, what I'd like to suggest you do is think about childhood, adulthood, and elderhood. There are 3 phases of life. Childhood lasts, it actually depends, right? So for some people it finishes at 18, and for some people it's 25, or recently I gave a talk and somebody said, I don't know, I don't think my spouse is there yet. But there are these stages, and there are stages even as we grow older. And Shakespeare, all those centuries ago, got that. He talked about the 7 stages of man, and he had some of the younger ones. But then he talked about all the men and women develop wisdom, but also eventually a fair round belly. Many of us can attest to that. Which in older age turns into spectacles on nose, right, and a shrunk shank, and you notice the muscles get smaller. And then eventually we get to what we call geriatrics. So he says, the last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. So sans is the French word for without. But that's the very, very end. And to say like somebody turns 65 and that's the very end is to devalue everything in between. And to say that the very end isn't worthy is to devalue the very end. So I think we need to think about aging as a series of stages and also to respect all the stages and their very different needs. Hemingway actually got this really well. So this was the book probably that pushed him over to get the Nobel Prize for Literature, Old Man and the Sea. Really short book, maybe 90-something pages. And it talks about an old Cuban fisherman named Santiago. And Hemingway contrasts, he captures the complexity of old age. So he talks about the man's tremendous inner strength and fortitude to keep working on these open seas, and at the same time, his relative physical weakness compared to him earlier in his life. He talks about the strong bonds with his community in the place where he's lived forever, and his loneliness since the death of his wife. He talks about his independence. He's going to keep doing this and fending for himself as best he can, but there's also a boy that helps him with some things that he actually needs help with at that point. And it also talks about one of the truths of old age where if you're expecting the same thing, even, me in my 50s, I can't run the way I ran at 25. Does that mean I should never run? Does that mean me running is useless? No, right? We change over time. And then there are workarounds, and he acknowledges that. When the boy asks Santiago whether he's still strong enough for a big fish, he says, I think so, and there are many tricks. And this is another one of the secrets of old age, is that there is a certain amount of wisdom and comfort with self. So you think about, how am I still going to do this, even if I can't do it the way I used to do it? And when you look at the people who age better and longer, their attitude about approaching these things and saying, it's okay, I'm going to do it a different way, those people live significantly longer. Really interestingly, they have lower rates of heart disease, they have lower rates of cancer. The degree to which a person internalizes their ageism affects their health in ways that can make a difference in their longevity up to 7 years in studies so far by Becca Levy at Yale. So it's really interesting, and ageism is very, very internalized. But then other people hold on to it, so hold on to their sense of self. So Hemingway shows one of those key and sort of overlooks realities of old age, which is that the same person is still inside. So my patients and relatives will also say, like, it's so weird, I look in the mirror, and there's this old woman or old man looking back at me, and I feel just like me, because you feel the same. You've never been old before. And Hemingway describes Santiago in a beautiful way. He says, everything about him was old. He describes the wrinkles and everything else. He says, everything about him was old except his eyes, and they were the same color as the sea, and were cheerful and undefeated. He was still himself. And I think one of the key goals to old age is retaining yourself. But that's hard, and that's where de Beauvoir comes in, because we have this tendency to other. So she said, she was the great French philosopher, otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. Thus it is that no group ever sets itself up as the one without setting up the other over and against itself. It's really easy to say, oh, they're old, or they're too slow, or oh, we're not bothering with them, they're so close to death anyway. As if they weren't us and the way we treat them isn't what becomes our own future, right? It's a little harder to think about yourself old because you've never been old, right? I used to think I would say like, well, so I know I'm not going to become a man in my life, but actually that happens quite frequently these days. So potentially I could, but definitely if I don't die, I will become old. And so thinking about what that means and what you'd want for yourself and the sort of consideration how you'd like to be treated makes good sense. But this otherness is natural. So I think what we can do is maybe not feel it, but recognize it for what it is and work around it. Okay. So House of God is the best-selling medical novel of all time. It was written in the mid-'70s by a guy that's a pseudonym. And the book is really about medical training. It's about his internship year, which was brutal. And it's not really about old people, but he makes a couple of comments because he was an internist, so he was seeing adults of all ages. And he says, before the House of God, I had loved old people. Now they were no longer old people. They were Gomers. And I could not love him anymore. So that's where the healthcare system comes in, because we pretend it's objective. But what it actually has done is structurally and individually embody the ageism that is pervasive throughout our society, right? So older patients of less value. And you see that everywhere. So I'm from very liberal San Francisco, where politically correct speech is the norm, where we started White Coats for Black Lives, where we stand up for all sorts of types of social justice, and people will think nothing of saying horrible things about old people. It's the one accepted prejudice. And so he had kind of embodied that. But he also talked about, essentially he learned the big secret of geriatrics. So when he did exactly what he was told by his supervisors, his very old, frail patients died. And when he actually listened to the patients and didn't do some of these tests on them and didn't do all these procedures, they got better and went home. And this is because of something we were discussing earlier today, that most research is not done on old people. Why? Because older bodies are different. But then we take those research results, even on conditions that are primarily conditions of old age, and we apply them and we give those medicines and those treatments to older people. So getting medicine in the United States can actually be quite dangerous. And he learned that if he actually used his head and thought about how well is this person doing, what matters to them, they would live and go home. Why Survive won the Pulitzer, also in the 70s, and is about as true today as it was then, although I think we're just starting to have things change. And it was Robert Butler, who was essentially this country's first modern big geriatrician, who talked about aging as the neglected stepchild of the human life cycle. He said, though we have begun to examine death, we have leaped over that long period of time preceding it, called old age. And we see this a lot in healthcare. So most centers in the last decade have established palliative care units or palliative care services. And our students, at least in our schools of medicine, nursing, and physical therapy, are really interested in end-of-life care. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them. And it's sort of considered sexy within medical lingo to help people die. But they're really not interested in the decades before that, right? So it's either I'm going to do obstetrics or I'm going to do end-of-life care. So this ageism continues, and indeed it was Butler who coined the term ageism. All right. So in gallery tours, if you've ever taken an art gallery tour, you don't look at all the pictures. So I'm now going to skip around a little bit and just take us to a completely different gallery. So this is an essay. American Scholar is a magazine, sort of general readership magazine, and Emily Fox Gordon is an essay writer. And she wrote an essay about turning 65. And so in this next room, we're going to sort of think about what are these different ages and what do they mean and what is old. Interestingly, Pew did a research poll of many thousands of Americans and asked people of different ages when old age began. And not surprisingly, the young people thought it began sooner than the old people. But just as funny, maybe just as interesting, when you ask those same people, when does youth end, the young people thought it didn't end till 40, and the older people knew it ended sometime in the 30s. So everybody was biased in their own favor in every possible direction in the study. So Emily Fox Gordon talks about turning 65. She says she'd really began to feel her age in recent years. Then she says, I hasten to add that though my muscles may be weakening and my joints stiffening, I'm not infirm. I'm as vigorous as I ever was, and reasonably healthy. Mentally, I'm quite intact, though my memory, always bad, grows worse. People tell me I seem younger than my years. Right, so she's basically describing a lot of the things we think about with old age, right? So she moves a little more slowly, and her muscles are weak, and her joints are stiff, and her memory isn't as good. And yet she says, but I don't feel old. And that's part of the thing of because you feel like yourself, and we have divorced the self from old age. Why can't you be yourself and be older? Why is it the self is only young? Right? Maybe she can be this older person and still be her. It also is because we conflate very old age with all of old age. At 65, she is at best a young old person. But that contradiction was her point, that in her body and life she had become sort of an old person, and yet she wasn't an old person in the way she thought of it as a person who couldn't do anything. But that's a myth. Most old people are just living life, right? And if you don't see them, it's because you're not looking, because only a very few are hidden away. But she had absorbed the cultural message that old is meaningless, and so if I still feel meaningful, I can't be old. She was getting older. She was eventually old, and she was meaningful, and she was herself. So this is Doris Grumbach, who began writing about old age at age 70. So then she said, at 65, I must have been resigned to aging and death. I can remember no raging against the night, no anger about what Yeats described as decrepit age that has been tied to me as to a dog's tail. But 70, this is different. This month at 70 seems disastrous, so without redeeming moments. And many people feel that way. Of course, I have a younger friend who just turned 30 and felt that way, so, it sort of depends on your perspective. So she felt that way. But then, at 90, it turned out it wasn't so bad, and at 100, oops, I didn't mean to press that one. And at 100, she was still writing essays. So she doesn't take as many trips now, but she still has a meaningful life. So at 70, she was thinking it's all over. And now it's been 31 years since then. It wasn't over, and she's had a lot of good life between then and now, but she listened to what we said, the cultural message that came through. This is Diana Anthill, who was a very famous British book editor. And she initially started writing, she had been an editor, and then basically in her late 80s started writing books and has published several. She's lived in a care home for many years because she didn't have children, but she's been publishing her books and touring the world from the care home. So also, think about what you associate and what you assume is possible or isn't. Her body needs some help. The rest of her is doing great. So she looking back at her younger self from 90, she says, all through my 60s, I felt I was still within hailing distance of middle age. Not safe on its shores, perhaps, but navigating its coastal waters. My 70th birthday failed to change this because I managed scarcely to notice it. But my 71st did change it. Being over 70 is being old. Suddenly I was aground on that fact and saw the time had come to size it up. And this happens often. But the other thing that is true is that the people who size it up, and when we don't say things, you'll remember that Emily Fox Gordon, people told her you look younger than what you are. That's actually a double insult, right? We think of it as a compliment, but it says that what you are is not good, cannot be good, especially if you look really good for your age, that the only way to look good is to be young. So it's really this double insult, and basically invalidates the whole remainder of your life. And so she was having that catastrophic reaction we have when we don't say, hey, yes, I'm 70 and I run this company, or, I'm 70 and I've been working this job for 50 years, or, I'm 70 and I take care of my grandkids. Yes, I still work. And I'm 70, so what? By 90, she finally conceded some physical changes. She says, dwindling energy is one of the most boring things about being old. So, right, just because you're old doesn't mean you think it's okay. People say, oh, it's okay, we're not going to do anything with them. They're old anyway, they're just tired, they'll sleep. A lot of times when older people are sleeping, sometimes it's because they're tired, and sometimes it's because everybody has written them off and they are bored out of their minds, as any of us would be. You can actually look up on YouTube the UK Loneliness Project, put a young man, looks to be in his 20s, into an apartment, sort of like a socially isolated elder, and he does okay for a while, and then he just gets weepy and he starts sleeping and he doesn't know what to do with himself. And you watch him realize, like, this has nothing to do with old age. This is about being locked up in an apartment being bored, right? And we say that's because you're old. No, that's because we've created a world in which people are locked up in apartments by themselves. Did I finish this? Oh, yes. So she said, from time to time you get a day where it seems to be restored, and you can't help feeling that you are back to normal, but it never lasts. You just have to resign yourself to doing less. So again, doing less isn't the same as doing nothing. And writing a few books is just one of the many ways you can do less in a productive and satisfying way. This next one is May Sarton. And so I knew about her books, that she had books on old age, and I looked them up, and then I put them in a sequence for this before I had read too many of them. So you see there's At 70, then there's Endgame, Journal of my 79th year, so she's thinking, wow, now I'm really old. Encore, Journal of my 80th year, that's sort of like, wow, I'm still here, now I'm 80, wow. Then at 82, still there, After the Stroke, and Recovering. Right? So I sort of assumed it went that way, but here's how it actually went. Recovering. This was from a romantic breakup. At 70, then she has the stroke, then she's being 79, then she's being 80, then she's being 82, writing books. So even catastrophic illness doesn't mean a person's life needs to come to an end. What people need more than anything, and actually, if you want to do something for health, there are actually the two most meaningful things for health aren't making sure the patient is taking a statin drug, or getting a mammogram. It's really about regular physical exercise and having a purpose in life. Those things correlate better with living longer and better than any other metrics, but they're considered non-medical, so you often don't hear about them. Okay, this is Donald Hall, who just died this summer, and made one of the best comments about poetry and men I've ever heard, which was he started writing essays after his 80th birthday, and that was because he decided that his testosterone levels were no longer at the right place for him to write really good poetry. He did actually publish some more poetry, which is in this week's New Yorker, but he turned to essays, and thank goodness for that. His last book was called Notes Nearing 90. He depicts a sometimes bleak view, but he does it while also just noticing the natural world and taking advantage of his smaller life space. So he says, in my 80s, the days have narrowed as they must. I live on one floor eating frozen dinners. I get around, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, new chair by the window, electric reclining chair for Chris Matthews and baseball. I spasm from one place to another, pushing a four-wheeled roller. I try not to break my neck. I write letters, I take naps, I write essays. Right, so that's the constricted life space. And I think one of the things we need to think about when we think about old age is when the body does less, how do we keep people engaged? He kept himself engaged through his art and through his friends. And that kept him going for a long time, but he did not do the exercise part. So, this is Roger Angell in his 90s, who wrote a great essay called This Old Man. And he talks about, I'm 93 and I'm feeling great. After a beat, he says, well, pretty great unless I've forgotten to take a couple of Tylenol. So there are aches and pains. He acknowledges the reality. And there's another reality that really does frame old age, but that we're afraid to talk about, right? He says, I'm not dead and not yet mindless in a reliable upstate facility. Decline and disaster impend, but my thoughts don't linger there. It shouldn't surprise me if at this time next week I'm surrounded by family, gathered on short notice to help decide after what's happened, what's to be done with me now. Disaster lurks. And so dying in old age is different. You're closer to it. But so in a class today, people were asking, well, how do you discuss that? And I think one of the ways is to acknowledge that human mortality is holding steady at 100% and will for the foreseeable future, and that dying in old age is your best possible outcome, and that the key is how do you make that life worthwhile? And also, because this has happened to some of my patients, what do we do if life is no longer worthwhile? It seems to me very different, morally, philosophically, biologically, if someone's life is no longer worthwhile and they're 97 and all their parts have worn out and all their friends and family are dead, than if they're 57 and depressed and feeling their life isn't worthwhile, or 37, right? But we don't talk about that. It's a different stage of life, and we probably need to be having different conversations. On the other hand, when we first started introducing talk of hospice and things like that a couple decades ago, people would use that as a reason to not provide care. And I think one of the key things you can do when you think about older people is, what is the best care I can give this person to give them the best life now? Same thing you should be doing for patients of all ages, right? But acknowledging that death may be a little closer, and we need to prepare for that as well, hoping it won't happen, planning to keep it away as long as the person wants to and feels good, but also being ready. Because I can tell you from now 25 years of experience, the people who are ready and prepared and have talked about it with their loved ones tend to have much better deaths than the people who don't. This was the Delaney sisters, Sarah and Elizabeth, who lived into their hundreds and had a book written with them at that age. And they say, they sort of acknowledge what I just said. When you're this old, you don't know if you're going to wake up in the morning. But I don't worry about dying. This is Sadie talking, and neither does Bessie. We are at peace. And that is also one of the other great joys of old age people don't talk about so much, is that there is a sense of, I have lived the full span, and I might want more, but I also get that it's okay, and I'm okay with who I am. And this book really speaks to them, and they had lived through a century of such change in their lives, and for people of color in this country. And having seen it change was one of their great pleasures, right? When we were young, we couldn't do this, and now we can do that. And we all have those experiences, what changed over our lives. So going to the next hallway. This will be different altogether. Does anybody recognize this person? So this is Chimamanda Adichie. She is a Nigerian-American writer and totally amazing. If you haven't read Americana, it's probably one of the best books of this century so far. But this is from a talk called The Danger of the Single Story. And she talks about when she came to America from Nigeria, she had a roommate in college. This was actually in Philadelphia, so near here. And the roommate just couldn't get her. She assumed that all Africans were very poor and lived with, flies in their eyes, and just could not see Chimamanda for a human being, a fellow human being. And her background was such that her mother was an administrator and her father was a professor, and she had been to, a great school, and that's why she was in America. And she says that her roommate's default position towards me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. And then she says the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue. So there are people like that in Africa. There are old people who can't do much and are suffering. So the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And her roommate did that to her, and we routinely do that with old age. You can listen to this talk. It's brilliant, which is typical. She won a MacArthur. So now I'll tell you how this plays out in healthcare. So this is not the actual person, but let's say this is a young resident I worked with a couple years ago, and he was telling me a story. And he'd written it up. I do some writing with our students. He'd written it up, and he wanted to send it in. And I said, okay, I'll have a look. And the story was about a really busy call night, and he gets the sign out on new admissions, and one of them is a 9-year-old dying. And he's an internist, so he doesn't see 9-year-olds. So he figures it's a 79-year-old, an 89-year-old, a 99-year-old, and he allots, 10, 15 minutes figuring like, okay, this will be easy and quick. And I'm going to see that person last. And he goes around and sees everyone else because he figures, another dying old lady. He's expecting this woman on the left. And when he enters the room, there's nobody there. And then he hears someone in the bathroom, and this young woman comes out. And he's completely speechless. Now, the medical condition of the young woman was precisely the condition written on the piece of paper. But it made a huge difference to him that it was a young person dying instead of an old person dying, right? As if it's really fun to die at any age and you're really looking forward to it. They had the same illness, and this happens everywhere, but it actually gets worse. So he then, in the essay, talks about telling this to his co-residents, and what he thought the take-home message was, and what they all thought the take-home message was, that you need to be really clear on your sign-out how old the person is, so that you can allocate your time properly. And that was the lesson they took from it, right? Yeah. So I wrote him back and I said, I'm assuming it's not finished, which I knew it was. And then we had a little chat. So this is the actual classroom in which I had my early classes as a medical student. And in medical school then, as in medical school now, as in nursing schools, as in physical therapy schools, as in social work schools, we learned about two categories of people. We learned about children, and we learned about adults. Now, sometimes, if the person was pregnant, we would learn that the standard patient, the 70-kilogram man, was actually a woman. And sometimes we would learn about other sorts of people who were different. We would get clues, like maybe they would have AIDS or they would have sickle cell disease. But basically, there was this standard person who was considered the norm. And everything else was abnormal. But if you actually look at the population of the United States, the 70-kilogram man who is neither young nor old, who is heterosexual, who is white, who is Christian, is a tiny percentage. So if we want to teach all people about all people, we have to think not just about the first half of the lifespan, but the second half, and also the greater diversity. So the norm actually doesn't apply to most of us in this room or to most of us in this country. All those people matter. And this gets reflected in what we study. So it sounds like it's fairly similar here, but the required rotations are adult medicine for doctors, adult medicine, surgery, family medicine, gynecology, psychiatry, pediatrics, neurology, and general. There's nothing about old people. But old people actually disproportionately take medications, they disproportionately use outpatient care, they disproportionately get surgery, they disproportionately are hospitalized, right? But there is no specific training in their care. And people are given drugs at the same dose they would get if they were 55 when they're 85. And then when something goes wrong, they say, well, it's the older kidney. No, it's the wrong dosing of the older kidney. So this really needs to change. And the good news is it's starting to. So in the 1970s, the National Institutes for Health began insisting that trials include people of color, women, and who else is it? Children, that's it. That's the geriatrician. I, of course, forgot the children. My apologies. Who is that other group? And they just passed a law last year that come this February, they will start having to include older people in trials. So we won't, for the rest of our lives, be giving drugs that are tested on the wrong people to other people. So we've acknowledged that just studying one sort of person doesn't help everybody, but now we need to get to that with old age. So I already gave away this line. So when our country was founded, men and women died in equal numbers in the end. Still now, we all die. And as far as we can tell, looking forward into the future, we will all die. So, so we need to talk about death, and we also need to understand that life is a passage, and that gives it definition. Doesn't mean we have to like it, doesn't mean it's not sad, but we'll do a better job if we acknowledge it. Now, here are some things we don't hear about old age. This is done in a variety of studies, tens of thousands of people. Look at this. This is happiness. So you're pretty happy when you're young. And then it turns out kind of young adulthood, middle age are pretty stressful. Actually, middle age really is terrible, right? People are very stressed and unhappy. And then round about 60, later 50s, things start to get better. And they remain better. Now, is this everyone? No, probably, elderly, incarcerated people or homeless people are not in these surveys. But they really tried to have a pretty representative sample of people from all different backgrounds, all different incomes, all different parts of the United States. And when you look at anxiety, you see the opposite. really, turning middle age is really the problem, clearly, from these graphs, right? And the same thing with life satisfaction. And this has been found in study after study after study. As people get older, they get more comfortable with who they are and what their priorities are. And that makes making decisions much easier. And actually, the failing physical body helps too, because I'm actually just not going to run another marathon. I'm just not going to do it. It's not an option. I don't even have to think about it and feel guilty about not doing it or train for doing it. I'm not going to do it. Okay. Although, there are people my age who could, but not me. So James Baldwin is having a rightful renaissance, so I thought I would include him here. And he's going to bring us back to books, because he had a pretty hard childhood, growing up poor in the Depression, harassed by police. He had a pretty mean stepfather. And he said, and this is something that I think is very useful for those of us in healthcare, he said, it was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most, which could be your studies, which could be the hours you're working at the hospital, which could be something else, the things that tormented me the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, all the people who had ever been alive. And so it's that human connection that books give us to people who are unlike ourselves. Remember, towards the beginning, I said you feel like you're there. So if you can read about people different than you, it makes it much easier to care for them and to provide care for them. All right, we're getting towards the end here. So this is Joan Didion. I've got a few here where you see the person young and old. It seems a shame that we need to see both. And in certain nursing homes, they'll show a picture of the person younger. And I once went to a party where a person in her 80s wore badges of herself younger, because she felt like nobody looked at her or saw her older. So think about, is it really, it's clearly the same person. Why can't we look at both and appreciate both? There are hard parts of old life, of old age. And another one, Joan Didion wrote this great book, The Year of Magical Thinking, after her husband died suddenly, and she begins it with these lines: life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. So in saying all these things, it's about our attitude, and it's not just the body. All that is true, but remember the danger of the single story. This is true, but so are those happiness graphs, right? It's all true together. When we deny complexity, we deny humanity. This is Oliver Sacks, who wrote an article for the Times called The Joy of Old Age upon turning 80. He said, my father, who lived to 94, often said that the 80s had been one of the most enjoyable decades of his life. He felt, as I begin to feel, not a shrinking, but an enlargement of mental life and perspective. One has had a long experience of life, not only one's own life, but others too. And in reading, you get even more experience of other lives, and it makes you more clear on who you are and what you want, and easier to be happy. But sometimes the rest of us, make that hard. So this is again Roger Angell and Donald Hall. Roger Angell tells a story about being out to dinner with some young friends after the death of his wife. So the friends were in their 60s. And he says, there's a pause in the conversation. Everybody's having a nice dinner out in New York. There's a pause, and I chime in with a couple of sentences. The others look at me politely, then resume the talk exactly at the point where they've just left it. What? Hello? Didn't I just say something? Have I left the room? Then parenthetically, he says, women, I know, say this begins to happen to them when they passed 50. When I mention the phenomenon to anyone around my age, I get back nods and smiles. Yes, we're invisible, honored, respected, even loved, but not quite worth listening to anymore. Meanwhile, he's writing for The New Yorker, one of the premier magazines, right? So clearly he had things to say and could have been listened to. Donald Hall had a variation of that experience. He says, a grandchild's college roommate encountered for the first time pulls a chair to sit with her back directly in front of me, cutting me off from the family circle. I don't exist. Recognize it's his family, not the grandchild's, right? Friends. And then he says, this is what it's like to be old. Old people are a separate form of life. They have green skin with two heads that sprout antennae. They can be pleasant, they can be annoying. And then listen for the ageism here. In the supermarket, these old ladies won't get out of my way, right? So he's an old guy and he has the same reaction, because we're all human. But most important, they are permanently other. When we turn 80, we understand that we are extraterrestrial. If we forget for a moment that we are old, we are reminded when we try to stand up, or when we encounter someone young who appears to observe green skin, extra heads, and protuberances. People's responses to our separateness can be callous, can be good-hearted, and is always condescending. And the whole system is set up with these same values, right? Because why? Because people set up the system, and we're all human. I just love that he puts ageism in the middle of his anti-ageism rant. And we just have to remember that people are people. I wanted to show you what Diana Anthill used to look like when she was the ingenue. And she actually talks about in her book how in her 70s she had been, I guess, quite the woman about town. She suddenly could look at men as if they weren't just sexual objects, and she says, it's just so interesting having all these conversations I never had before. So things change in all kinds of ways, and what seems like a negative can have a very positive side to it. Okay. Lastly, here's an old man in bed. There are some medicines by the bedside. When I show this to medical students, they will describe what I have. They'll try and guess his conditions. They'll wonder if he's got a list of things here. Well, it turns out this was Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was 70 at the time and lived another 10 years. In those 10 years, he wrote 10 novels, 5 nonfiction books, 5 short story collections, 7 children's books, and won the Nobel Prize. Now, most patients this age, most of us, let's face it, in a whole lifetime won't do all that, or even a small fraction of it. But the point is, you can see an old person in bed and make all kinds of assumptions that may or may not be true. And you're probably not making the same assumptions about a young person lying in his bed. And then I'm going to tell one other story. So this is from Letter from Greenwich Village. This is Vivian Gornick now. She wrote this a little while ago. But she talks about coming out on a winter's day in New York, and there's a newly poured stretch of concrete. And the workmen have put this little plank, and it's got this little wobbly rail over it. And she's about to cross, but she looks, and she sees what she calls a tall, painfully thin, and fearfully old man. And so wordlessly, she holds out a hand to him, and wordlessly, he takes it and comes across. And then she says he's the first to speak. "Thank you," he says. "Thank you very much." And she writes, "A thrill runs through me." "You're welcome," I say, in a tone that I hope is as plain as his. We each then go our separate ways, but I feel that thank you running through my veins for the rest of the day. So she's sitting there saying, what was it? He was tall and painfully thin and frightfully old and totally sexy, or something what happened? And she says it was his voice that had done it. That voice, strong, vibrant, self-possessed. It did not know it belonged to an old man. There was in it not a hint of that beseeching tone one hears so often in the voice of an old person when small courtesies are shown, as though the person is apologizing for the room he or she is taking up in the world. We discussed at lunch today how people assume they will take care of children, but don't necessarily want to take care of older patients, so the older patients don't want their children taking care of them, right? We make it something you have to apologize for, instead of this is something that makes us human. This is one of the beautiful ways in which we are families for each other throughout life. So the very end here. There are lots and lots and lots of books that are specifically about old age. And I recommend particularly for the younger people, but maybe also for the older people, because in studies, some of the people who are most ageist are older people. And at some retirement communities and continuing care communities, if something happens to one part of a couple, they're not allowed to eat with their friends anymore. They have to move to the advanced unit. So this is something we all do because we're all human, and you all want to be on the side of the more powerful, the more sanctioned. So how do we change that? Well, we make it more sanctioned. We make it okay. And maybe reading, getting into other people's heads can help with that. And with that, I will stop, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And there are some students coming, I think, with microphones if you want to ask, or I can repeat. Showstopper. Oh, there's one there.
Dementia in old age.
Dementia in old age.
That scares me.
Yes. So people are actually more scared, they're most scared of cancer, and dementia is number 2 on the list for most people. Yes, and yeah, so, that's an average. For a lot of people, it's number 1. Speak about it generally, or did you have a particular?
Her mother and my mother both have dementia. My mother gone, she had dementia.
Right.
Having to clean her up.
From a caregiving standpoint, care of the health professionals and family.
Right.
And I don't want to be in that spot.
Right. So dementia is a tough one. It is, what I was talking earlier about maintaining the self and how the self feels the same. But in dementia, that's sort of the exception, right? The self is there for a good long time, but then it's less there, or at least it's less visible to us on the outside. And that is existentially deeply troubling to most people. And it's a loss of control. And you two are also talking about the caregiving, which I too have done in my family. There have been a lot of trials of dementia which have failed this year. And then there was one recent highlight. But I think one of the key things about dementia is this thing I was talking about in old age, that we might need some different rules. And New York State actually just passed different advanced directives where people who think they might get dementia, or even if they don't know, can say, if I reach a certain phase of dementia, and it has to be, at least sort of moderate phase, you can withhold feeding, and the person will die. And that sounds really cruel, but it's the only way a person who then loses control can maintain control over the end of their life. I should also tell you that we know from people who are cognitively completely with it and yet dying of some cancer, that when you stop eating and drinking, it sounds like a horrible thing, right? There's no culture on the planet that doesn't use food as a way of caregiving and nurturing. But when a person stops eating or drinking, they have a day or two of hunger, and then they actually get a bit of euphoria. And the key thing that's disturbing to them is a really dry mouth and lips. So you can keep a person comfortable. And there's actually a trend among people who've sort of had enough and are not living in right to die states of basically stopping eating, people who don't have dementia. So it's a little bit of a crazy world where and our state just passed right to die, but the regulations for it are such that if you're really old or if you have dementia, it's doesn't apply to you. So think about how you can plan for that, and also consider that a lot of people think, I wouldn't want to live in this condition. And as they get closer to this condition, they actually find their life is worth living. On the flip side, there are other people who really end up just waiting to die. So how do you control that? Well, you want to have a designated surrogate who you trust to make the decisions you would want to make for yourself. So not the decisions they want. We also discussed this a bit earlier today, that sometimes the person who loves you best is not the person who can do what you want, because all they really want is you, right? They want you around no matter what. And sometimes that person can do the hard work. But the really important thing is to have a surrogate decision maker who can and will do what you want in a variety of situations. And to really think about all the people you know and all the stories you hear and decide what is acceptable for you and what is unacceptable. Part of the reasons it's hard to legislate is, having done this for 25 years, one person's acceptable is unacceptable to someone else. And the same, and vice versa, right? So we need something that allows for our individuality. So really thinking about what you can tolerate, and also thinking about what I said earlier, where we change babies' diapers all the time and little toddlers, and yet somehow once you've been an adult, it feels different, right? But I knew how to do that and now I don't. It's different than the trajectory. But some of that is our mindset. If we really looked at life as an arc, we would say, I expect to need these things again, right? Early on I need them, and if I live long enough, I will need them again, and that is normal. One of the young students, it was a faculty or a staff member today, said she would much rather be taking care of an older person than a baby, right? So we also are very much socially sanctioned baby care, but less so older care. My own father did say to me at one point when we first reached that stage, he said, okay, now I'm officially an old man. Like, that's it. This is the line we've crossed. And a lot of people feel that way. So the best you can plan for that, and then do the things like, if you can be physically active, that seems to help a lot in delaying dementia. If you can be mentally active. There's no, magic bullet at this point, but the more activity of all kinds, social engagement, that does seem to delay it. Reading, actually, the more you can have other circuits that your brain can use, those workarounds that Hemingway's character talked about, that's a great idea. But really, we can't for sure prevent it, so you have to be clear on, I want to live if it's like this, and if it gets to this point, there are things you can do legally now. You can say, if I even have a minor infection that you could fix like that with antibiotics, don't give them to me. Put me on hospice and give me morphine anyway. That is totally legal and viable. It's not fine if you're, a healthy younger person. I couldn't suddenly say, oh, I have a bladder infection, don't treat it, I want to die, right? But if you are of advanced age and have a progressive terminal disease, then that is a valid option. Not necessarily in the first phases of dementia, but as you get a little further on. And that needs to be written down. And in this day and age, I actually think the most effective way is to film a video. Because written documents people dispute, but if you get all the people who are interested in it in the room and say, let's show him the respect of letting him speak for himself. He's actually very clear in what he wants. And now let's give him this last final gift of love, and let's let him make his own decision, and we're going to do what he asked for. So, sorry, that was a really long answer. Dementia, we could talk about dementia for weeks. Yes?
Do you find that depression in older people is exaggerated because they have no purpose, or is it because that they are distraught over their aging?
So it can be all those things. So for years, actually, the data on depression was that it was much lower in older people than younger people. And that's actually shifting with the generational shift. And I do wonder if some of it was the language. The great generation was really tough. And the boomer generation is more likely to say, I'm depressed or I'm unhappy. So clearly social isolation and purposelessness are huge triggers for depression. What was the other part of it? Oh, they're just worried about their own aging. Yeah, so there are also existential crises, right? Like, now I'm old, but that kind of goes with not having a purpose, because we define old as purposeless, right? But lots of people have purpose, and it also depends on what you count as doing things. The middle-aged people who are so miserable in all those studies are always saying, I wish I had time for this or that or the other thing. And then when they get time for it, they're like, oh, now I'm so old. So we have to make up our minds here, right, and just enjoy it. And it's very clear from Becca Levy's incredible research at Yale, she's a psychologist, that how you think about your aging really determines what it is. But we also need to make it easier for people not to be isolated. There's all these jokes about older people and technology. Well, it was made for younger people. Think of the size of the small phones. Even in middle age, you can't see it. You're like, is it better with my glasses, without my glasses? How is my mother supposed to read it? That's ridiculous. Right in the little tiny, so you make something for young people and then old people have trouble using it. Okay, well, we could make it for old people and the young people might struggle, right? So we do all these things structurally, or we make it very hard for people to get places. So a lot of it is about social connection, and this huge focus on loneliness and social isolation will make a difference on depression. We also, sort of like aging, depression is really stigmatized. And now with these great scans, you can actually see the colors in the brain change. If somebody's blood sugar was out of whack, we wouldn't say, like, buck up. Control your blood sugar, get your mind to it, right? No, so we shouldn't say that for depression. If the hormones and the chemicals in your brain have changed and there's a way we can make that better, even if you are legitimately grieving, the coming end of your own life or the loss of someone you love, that's not a reason not to get treatment and not to get the person involved. So I think it's really multifactorial, but we also tend to make things worse with our decisions and policies. And a lot of people just assume, oh, it's a grumpy old person. Well, actually, people who are sick are much more likely to be depressed, and when you're old, you're more likely to be sick. So when you're old and sick, we need to address your depression. Seems like simple algebraic sort of thing. Yes?
It's comforting to hear you say in the beginning, I'm not sure if I have your statistic right, but about 3% of the elderly are in a home. I have parents in their 80s, early 80s, and their fear more so than dementia and illness is being put in a home.
Right.
And I'm one of 5 children. And
Oh, so they're well insured.
well, that's what I was gonna say, and it's interesting, because Linda moved away, and I'm the one that has committed to care, and I'm happy to do that, and they're glad that there's at least one of us. But I'm just wondering, are you seeing any trends where children are, changing their mindset, stepping up, or even, for example, we have elderly neighbors that don't have kids, and they're
Right.
scared of being alone, and we try to tell them, we'll be there for you. Are you seeing any changes in that respect where people's children or younger people are trying to step in and do more of the care or more of the assistance so people aren't being put in homes?
I think so, and I also think the people who are growing older now are more likely to speak up and say, I actually want to stay at home. And there are lots of things you can do. So even if you're young and you're buying or building a new house, or you're middle-aged and you're redoing some part of your house because now it's falling down, make it aging in place friendly. But that's actually hard because they make things so ugly, right? And that too is a social choice. They don't have to be ugly. Like, the handles and the rails and all that. I mean, how different is that from a doorknob or from all these other things? So, and people, there's a market for everything. It's America, right? So any day now this is coming. And you could probably get someone to do it. So, if that just became the norm, if every time you went into a bathroom, it was a bathroom anybody of any age could use, how great would that be? But people also tend to say, well, I'm not going to put those things in because then people will know I'm old. Which sometimes, I want to look at them and say, like, well, I think they might know already. I'm not going to use the cane because then they'll know I'm old. Well, actually, the way you're walking really is worse. But we also have to normalize those things and be able to talk about them and make it okay. And there are more and more organizations that are also trying to help the people who don't have supports. And we're working on something in San Francisco which would be a sort of reciprocal thing, which the idea came to me there's an organization called Little Brothers Friends of the Elderly, which is the biggest organization in France, and it works with older people on social isolation. And people love to volunteer for it. But we had a young woman at the events in San Francisco who went up with the older woman she was paired with and said, it's just one of the funnest things she does, young tech worker. And she really hopes that someone was doing something similar for her grandmother in Tennessee. So imagine if you had the whole world where people could move, but you're helping someone and somebody else. And yes, that's utopian and it's never going to happen for everyone. But it's the sort of thing that actually does happen. And if you think about some of the crazy things with strangers, like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, right? If you had told people about this 15 years ago, they'd been like, you're going to get in a stranger's car in the middle of the night in a city? Are you crazy? Or you're going to go live in someone's house? So caregiving we need to include these sort of tech models and new ways of thinking into caregiving also. And I think that's the sort of thing that the younger generations gets excited about, So talk about let's disrupt this experience and then start speaking a language that crosses generations really helps. But older people don't want to move, but then you've got to have the house ready. Or downsize, so it's a place you can control. Or move off the hill in San Francisco. On the other hand, the longer you walk up that hill, right? So I had a son of one of my patients who has all these stairs, and he's like, she's got to get out of this house. I'm like, look at her go up those stairs. That's amazing. This is she doesn't need to go to the gym. She'll go up and down the stairs, and she says, yeah, I do this 6 times a day. I'm like, this is why your mother is doing superbly. So.
Hello. I have a question.
There you are.
I take care of my 91-year-old father, who is a 22-year veteran of the Marines, and he is depressed. And I've tried to get him counseling. I've taken him to the VA. They gave him a 30-year-old young woman to talk to. He refused to open up, said, take me home, I'm not coming back here. I took him for counseling another place, and he doesn't want it, but he's clearly depressed and he needs help. And then if I call his doctor or the VA back, they say, well, does he want to harm himself or someone else? So then I say, no, well, then he has to want the care. So then they call him, and then he refuses the care. So I'm stuck in this circle, and I don't know how to get help for him. Is there any recommendation? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a very particular instance of a particular generation, and a lot of the men, so was it World War II for him, or? Yeah, so a lot of the men of that generation just did not discuss it. But the people they're most likely to discuss it with are other guys of that generation. So I don't know if there are other veterans groups, like don't worry about the official counselor. He needs people he can trust, who know what he's talking about, who've been there. You know, he probably doesn't want to traumatize you by telling you about it, because he's your dad and he's going to take care of you. It doesn't matter how old he is, right? So if you can find a group of older veterans, that might get him started. And if he can see a way out, then he might be more amenable to some of the other things. But that, at our VA, we found that to be the most helpful intervention, more than, the 30-year-old who means well. Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when you knew that you were a reader and a writer and you were going to be a doctor, and how all that factored in together. I think it's really important for us to hear how that trajectory happened.
Well, I was always a reader, I think because my mother always read to me and talked to me, and it kind of breaks my heart when you see people with their little kids and they're on their phone and they're not talking to the kid, so don't do that. Read to your child, speak to your child. So she really got me to love books and was always giving me books, and my parents had books everywhere, so some of it I was lucky, I was born into a household that valued that. So I always thought I would do something like that. And then I got to college and started, I had to work, so I worked various jobs and started seeing, mostly it was Southeast Asian refugees in Providence in that time, and I really wanted to be useful. And so then I thought I would be a teacher, and I did some of that for a while. But what I realized for traumatized people was that they mostly went to healthcare providers to talk about it, or it would get somaticized. And I really wanted to be the person they would come to and to have something to give them. So then I went to medicine, and I really didn't think it would have anything, reading and write. I mean, that reading was something I did on my own, right? That has nothing to do with medicine. And then I got older, and I was sick for a while, and I thought, well, I've got one life. I always wanted to write. I'm going to try. And the great thing about being in healthcare is that I was really very bad at it. At the beginning, it didn't matter because I'm a doctor. So, right, I've got a job. Awesome. So I can be really bad at this, and it kind of freed me up. And then that went on for a very long time because really I was terrible. So it took years and years and years, and I just kept taking classes. And then I wrote the book, which I started writing all sorts of other books, but I ended up telling these stories because the stories we have and the people we get to have relationships with are just unbelievable. So I wanted to capture that somehow. And the book is fiction, but I feel like it's completely true to my experience of life. Each one started with something real, but then it really took me a lot of years, and I don't even remember the real thing anymore. But it's true. And then this is the part where they start coming together. Because it was a little bit about medicine, people would ask me to talk and then write things, and I realized I could use that same writing to talk about things that matter in healthcare, or to talk about the needs of patients, or to humanize them. That thing I was talking about literature doing. Can I tell a story where a person sees this kind of person they would normally disdain or not think about as a human being? Can I get them to think about this topic and do something about it that will make the world a better place for all of us? So they started to come together, and then it turns out, I think I sort of got lucky timing-wise, because in the age of the internet and blogs and social media and digitally being, suddenly there are platforms everywhere. I mean, it used to be the only way to get published. There were a few places, and there were people in charge of it. And more people are advocating more, and more people in healthcare are becoming advocates. So I now spend a lot of time teaching people how to write advocacy on behalf of patients or for transformation of the healthcare system, and tons of people want to do that. And you don't have to do the whole MFA literary thing to do it well. You have to know the stories and be able to tell them clearly. But it's actually one of the great joys of my life that it got to come together to do something useful. So, should we stop? Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think this just about concludes our evening. I would like all of you to help me thank Dr. Louise Aronson for being with us this evening.
Thank you. It was
And
fun.
sharing her expertise. I hope you've all learned a lot from your evening. And the one final thing I will share with all of you is just a reminder, if you are here for any CME or PSNA credits, on the back of your program is your information on how you can use our EAD system to go ahead and register for your credits. So thank you again. It was wonderful having you all here tonight, and thank you, Dr. Aronson.
Thank you.
Thank you.